The first blast hit just before sunrise, a low roar that rolled across the sand and turned into a wall of sound. The air shook, the ground trembled, and everything inside the hangar rattled. Wrenches clattered to the floor as mechanics dove for cover, shouting over the rising scream of sirens. The smell of burning diesel and hot metal filled every breath. Outside, mortars fell in rhythm, each one closer than the last, shaking the sheet metal walls like thunder that had forgotten how to end. Someone yelled for the fire suppression crew, another for the medic, but no one could hear anyone anymore. The radio squawked and hissed through static. A voice, tight and desperate, cut through the chaos, asking if there was any rated Apache pilot on base. The message repeated, sharp and hollow. The mechanics froze. Hands stopped moving. Even the roar of engines seemed to hold still for a moment. Then came silence, broken only by the crackle of distant flames. Near the back of the hangar, Staff Sergeant Emily Carter crouched beside the AH-64E she had been servicing since midnight. Dust and sweat streaked across her face, and her hands still smelled of hydraulic fluid. She looked up toward the loudspeaker, heart hammering, the question echoing inside her head. Around her, no one moved. The pilots were gone. The noise outside was getting closer. Emily wiped the grit from her eyes, stood slowly, and stared at the Apache. Her voice came out low, but steady, barely rising above the hum of the sirens as she said she could fly it. The moment stretched, a heartbeat caught between fear and decision. Then the base came alive again. But nothing sounded the same after that. Emily Carter grew up under a Texas sky so wide it seemed endless. Her earliest memories were of sitting beside her father, Captain Robert Carter, in the worn leather seat of an old flight simulator he kept in their garage. He flew the UH-1 Huey for the Army and carried himself with the calm certainty of someone who belonged to the air. When he talked about flying, his voice softened. He said the sky was the one place where everything made sense, where freedom had a sound, and it was the hum of rotor blades cutting through morning wind. When she was 12, the phone rang on a quiet Sunday afternoon. Her mother didn't say anything after she answered. Emily remembered only the way her hand shook as she dropped the receiver and how the world suddenly felt smaller. The crash report said engine failure during low-altitude maneuvers. No survivors. At the funeral, the sound of the flag folding was louder than anything else. Emily stood beside the casket, staring at the pilot wings pinned to her father's uniform, and made a silent promise that she would finish what he started. At 18, she joined the Army and pushed herself through every phase of training with a single goal. When she was accepted into warrant officer flight training at Fort Novosel, she called her mother at 2:30 p.m., her voice trembling with pride. Every exam, every simulator, every maneuver felt like one step closer to her father's sky. Then came the medical screening. A slight vision defect in her left eye, less than a full diopter, was enough to end it. The doctor spoke kindly, but the words cut deeper than she expected. She didn't quit. She reclassified as a 15 Romeo, an Apache attack helicopter repairer. If she couldn't fly the birds, she would keep them alive. Years passed, and the hangar became her second home. The smell of jet fuel clung to her skin, and the sound of engines warming up became a kind of heartbeat she could count on. Late at night, when the lights dimmed and the noise faded, she would slip into the corner where an old simulator gathered dust. The fans groaned, the screen flickered, and she would fly in silence until the base went dark. Every night ended the same way, her fingers tracing the worn edge of the controls, whispering to herself that one day she would prove she was meant for the sky. The first mortar hit near the north fence line, close enough to make the entire hangar tremble. Tools clattered from shelves and sparks shot from a generator that toppled against the wall. Mechanics scrambled for cover, crawling under workbenches or diving behind crates of ammunition. The air filled with dust, the kind that grits between your teeth and tastes like metal. Another round struck closer, and the echo rolled through the steel ribs of the hangar like a deep, angry drum. Outside, flames rose from the flight line where two AH-64E Apaches burned. Their rotors warped and blades twisted. The heat shimmered through the open doors, bending the air like a mirage. That left only one aircraft still standing, tail number 734. The same one Emily Carter had rebuilt through the night. She crouched behind a toolbox, feeling the vibration of the blasts in her chest. The radio crackled through the static with clipped voices calling for evacuation, medical teams, and fire suppression. The hangar doors slammed open, and Lieutenant Colonel David Whitman stumbled inside, his uniform blackened with soot, his face streaked with sweat. He barked into the radio, demanding any available Apache pilot. The voice on the other end came back hollow and final. None left standing. Sir. All rated personnel down or out. For a moment, the only sound was the whine of distant alarms and the dull thud of another explosion outside. Whitman stood frozen, his eyes on the single helicopter that still gleamed under the emergency lights. Emily rose through the haze, her boots crunching on broken glass. Her voice was steady, cutting through the noise. She told him she could fly it. The colonel turned toward her, disbelief hardening into a grim stare. Your maintenance, he said quietly. You're not flight certified. Emily met his gaze and told him she knew that aircraft better than anyone alive, that she built her from the frame up. The walls shook again as another blast struck nearby, rattling the doors on their hinges. Whitman hesitated only a second longer, then gave the order. Get her airborne, Sergeant. The sirens wailed on, but their sound faded under the rising whir of rotors beginning to turn. Emily ran through the sand, the air thick with smoke and the metallic taste of dust. The hangar lights flickered as another distant blast rolled across the base. Tail number 734 waited under a haze of grit and heat, the aircraft she had rebuilt bolt by bolt. She climbed onto the stubwing, her boots slipping slightly against the scorched metal. Her hands moved without hesitation. Fuel cap secure, pressure steady, blades clear, hydraulics within limits. She ran the checklist from memory, her fingers tracing each panel with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Inside the cockpit, the air felt still. The switches, levers, and screens surrounded her like old friends waiting for a signal. She strapped in and pulled her helmet on, the seal of the flight vest clicking into place. The auxiliary power unit came alive with a rising whine, its vibration humming through the seat. Engine 1 start. Engine 2 start. She watched the rotor RPM climb, steadying in the green. The multifunction displays lit up in soft shades of amber and green, showing everything ready for flight. Her voice was steady as she spoke into the intercom. Reporting systems nominal, fuel full, and armament safed. Between each motion, a memory flickered, her father's voice teaching her about balance and trust, the way his hands rested gently on the controls. She reached into her pocket and unfolded the old photograph. The paper was worn and creased, edges darkened by time. Her father smiled beside his Huey. Sunlight caught in his hair. She taped it just above the altimeter, right where she could see it. For him, for every hour she spent beneath these blades. Outside, the hangar shook as rotor wash swept through, stirring dust into swirling columns. Emily's voice came over the radio, calm and sure. Falcon operations. This is Grease 1. Ready for lift. A pause followed. Then the colonel's voice answered, low and firm, granting clearance. The turbine whine deepened into a roar. The ground vibrated beneath her as the rotors gained speed. The aircraft came alive under her touch. And for the first time, she was no longer fixing it. She was becoming part of it. The Apache lifted from the tarmac in a storm of dust and sand. The rotor wash whipped across the hangar as the aircraft climbed into the orange haze of dawn. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter gripped the cyclic with steady hands, her voice calm over the radio as she checked in. Grease 1 airborne. Heading north to grid 045. The engines hummed with power, a deep mechanical rhythm that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Below her, the desert stretched wide and empty, broken only by plumes of smoke rising in the distance. She dropped to low altitude, skimming the dunes at less than 100 feet. The horizon shimmered under the heat. Her helmet-mounted display painted ghostly green outlines of terrain and movement across her visor. Through the data, she saw them. A convoy of 5 hostile trucks moving fast, leaving trails of dust. A small group of U.S. soldiers was pinned down near a dry wadi, their radio calls frantic through the static. Falcon ground to Grease 1, multiple hostiles closing fast. We're taking fire. Emily steadied her breathing, fingers finding the weapon control switches. M230 chain gun armed, Hydra rockets loaded. The targeting symbology blinked steady on the HUD. She lined up the lead vehicle, thumb resting on the trigger. The sound inside the cockpit dropped into a stillness that felt almost sacred. She squeezed. The rocket streaked forward, a bright white arc that vanished in an instant. The impact ripped the first truck apart in a flash of fire and metal. The explosion lit the desert floor and threw debris high into the air. The rest of the convoy swerved and slowed. Ground radio burst alive with shouts of relief. Direct hit. Grease 1. You nailed it. Emily banked hard left, pushing the cyclic forward to gain speed for another pass. The helicopter trembled under the strain, its rotors cutting cleanly through the thin air. The 30mm chain gun fired in short bursts, brass casings tumbling from the side of the aircraft. Each hit chewed at the second vehicle until it erupted into smoke. She could feel the vibration through her seat, the pulse of the gun matching her own. Then, the missile warning tone screamed in her headset, sharp and rising. Instinct took over. Flares out. Hard right bank. She dumped countermeasures and watched a bright streak chase the heat before exploding 50 meters behind her. The shockwave rocked the Apache, and alarms blinked across her screen. Tail rotor vibration warning. Torque fluctuation. Her eyes moved fast over the instruments. The tail had taken shrapnel. Control felt heavy, sluggish on the pedals. Command's voice came over the radio, clipped and firm. Grease 1. Return to base immediately. That's an order. Emily didn't answer right away. The convoy was regrouping. 2 trucks were still moving toward the trapped soldiers. She looked at the HUD, at the flickering green boxes marking targets. Then she spoke, her voice steady but low. Negative. I finish this, or they die. She turned back toward the convoy, fighting the controls with every inch of muscle. The tail rotor groaned, and the entire airframe shuddered. She dropped to 50 feet, lined up her last 2 rockets, and fired. The explosions tore through the sand, throwing the remaining vehicles onto their sides. Her chain gun followed, sweeping the area with short, precise bursts until the radio confirmed no movement. A Falcon ground called again. This time with cheers in the background, hostiles down, convoy neutralized. You did it. Grease 1. Emily exhaled slowly, her hands tightening on the cyclic. The aircraft trembled, but held steady. Smoke drifted in the distance, curling into the sunrise. She adjusted power, bringing the Apache around toward base. The damage warning light still blinked red, but the engine's hum was steady enough to carry her home. She took a deep breath, focused on the horizon, and began the long, careful flight back through the silence that follows battle. The desert stretched silent beneath her as Emily eased the Apache toward home. The tail rotor warning light flashed red on the console, steady and merciless. Each pedal movement fought her back, the controls heavy with vibration. The aircraft groaned under the strain, a deep metallic protest that rattled through the seat. She kept the altitude low, barely 50 feet above the sand, moving slow to keep the tail stable. Every adjustment demanded strength, but her breathing stayed calm, steady through the helmet. Over the radio, operations called her position every few seconds, their voices tight. The colonel's tone came through once, low and clipped, asking for confirmation of flight status. She answered simply, still in control, still airborne. The base shimmered ahead through the heat, a blur of tents and metal under the rising sun. She felt the tail rotor pulse unevenly, every turn a negotiation between torque and will. When she crossed the perimeter, alarms filled the cockpit, the engine temperature creeping high. She ignored them. The only thing that mattered now was the landing. The skids met the ground hard. The impact slammed through her spine and shook loose the gear strapped behind her. The Apache bounced once, the left skid digging deep before settling flat. The rotors whined as she pulled the throttles down, the vibration finally easing into a long metallic sigh. The noise faded until there was nothing left but her heartbeat and the hiss of cooling metal. The hangar doors burst open. Soldiers ran across the tarmac, their shouts mixing with the hum of the fading blades. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman stopped a few feet from the cockpit. His face was streaked with dust, his voice calm but weighted. He told her she had disobeyed a direct order and saved 44 lives. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Emily slid down from the seat, her boots hitting the ground hard enough to send a shock through her knees. Around her, the noise grew, cheers rising with the wind. She stood beside the Apache, watching the rotors slow, the heat shimmer off the fuselage, and felt it settle inside her. She was no longer just the one who fixed the bird. She had flown it. The investigation began 3 days after the battle. A team from Army Aviation Command arrived in unmarked transport, their uniforms crisp against the dust and chaos of the forward base. They carried binders of reports, hard drives, and a quiet authority that filled every room they entered, and so. The hangar that once shook from mortars now held a different kind of pressure. Soldiers lowered their voices when they passed by. Everyone knew what the inquiry meant. Emily sat through hours of questioning, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. Legal officers asked about her decision-making, about when she took control, about whether she understood the risks. Her answers were steady, brief, without hesitation. She explained torque ratios and hydraulic responses with the same clarity she used when training new mechanics. Then came the footage. Her helmet camera video played across a large screen, showing the Apache bucking under fire, the warning lights blinking, the horizon spinning and leveling again under her control. No one spoke while it played. When it ended, the room stayed silent for a long moment. The senior aviation officers leaned back, watching the frozen image of her cockpit still lit by red alarms. Finally, a Chief Warrant Officer 5, gray at the temples, broke the silence. He said her recovery under pressure was textbook, that pilots with thousands of flight hours had failed where she hadn't. The comment lingered, breaking the weight in the air. One by one, the officers nodded. 2 weeks later, the decision came down. No reprimand, no suspension. Instead, a formal commendation for valor and an entry of her call sign, Grease 1, into the official unit record. The ceremony was small, held outside the hangar she had once worked in quietly. Lieutenant Colonel Whitman stood before her, the medal in his hand. His words were simple, spoken just loud enough for the gathered soldiers to hear. Her father would have been proud. Emily met his eyes and said softly that she hoped so. Applause followed, modest but heartfelt. Around them, the wind carried the sound of distant rotors, a reminder that the sky she once only repaired had finally accepted her as one of its own. 6 months after the battle, the noise of war had faded into memory. At Fort Novosel, Alabama, The hum of ceiling fans replaced the whine of turbines, and the smell of oil and fuel still lingered, but without urgency. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter stood at the front of a small classroom, her sleeves rolled up, a whiteboard behind her filled with diagrams of rotor assemblies and torque distribution charts. Rows of young mechanics sat before her, their notebooks open, eyes wide, hands still clean from the world they had not yet entered. Her voice was steady, carrying the calm confidence of someone who had lived through the kind of moments training could never replicate. She walked between the rows as she spoke about the importance of procedures, checklists, and teamwork. Then she paused, erasing part of the diagram with the side of her hand. Rules, she said, keep us alive. But sometimes life doesn't wait for the rule book. When everything breaks down, what's left is character. The room went quiet. The ceiling fan ticked slowly above them. A hand went up near the back. The student looked barely 20, his voice small but sincere as he asked, "What happens if you stand up and fail?" Emily smiled. It was the kind of smile that came from having seen failure, fear, and survival all in the same day. "Then you fail," she said, softly. "But at least you tried. The only thing worse than failure is watching others fall because you were too afraid to move." The silence that followed was different this time, heavy but full of respect. The lesson had landed deeper than anything written in a manual. At the back of the room, Lieutenant Colonel Whitman leaned against the doorframe, listening. He didn't speak, but when their eyes met, the same understanding passed between them that had once been forged in fire and dust. As the class dismissed, Emily stacked her notes neatly and stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The wind carried the faint thump of helicopter rotors from the airfield nearby. She looked up, shading her eyes against the sun, watching a pair of Apaches cut across the sky in formation. For a moment, she let herself breathe in the sound, the same sound that had once defined her father's world. Now it belonged to her, too. She smiled quietly, knowing she would never choose between the ground and the sky again. The hallway at Fort Novosel was quiet, lined with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint rhythm of distant rotor blades somewhere beyond the walls. The camera moved slowly past framed photos of soldiers, instructors, and flight crews until it stopped at a glass display case near the end of the corridor. Inside, 2 flight badges rested side by side. The first belonged to Captain Robert Carter, a UH-1 pilot who had once flown above jungles and deserts. The second, newer, but just as worn, bore the name Staff Sergeant Emily Carter, callsign Grease 1. Between them sat a faded photograph. A young girl with wind-tossed hair stood beside her father in front of a Huey. Sunlight spilling across their faces. Both smiled, unaware of the years and sacrifices that would follow. Beneath the display, a brass plaque caught the light. The engraving was simple. She fixed the bird, then flew it. The reflection of passing soldiers crossed the glass, each one pausing for a moment before walking on, the hum of the ceiling fans blending with the echo of memory. The narrator's voice entered softly, calm and measured, like the low thrum of an engine winding down. True heroism isn't always found in the ones who were born to fly. Sometimes it lives in those who spend their lives making sure others can. It's found in hands stained with grease, in long nights under flickering lights, in quiet decisions made when no one else is left to act. The voice lingered, letting the words breathe before continuing. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the choice to move anyway. Outside, the sound of helicopters grew louder, rising and falling with the wind. The camera lifted toward the open sky where 2 Apaches crossed paths, their silhouettes cutting through the light. The narrator's final words came with the rhythm of rotor blades, steady and strong. Heroes aren't always the ones with wings. Sometimes, They're the ones who built them. The screen faded to black as the sound carried on, a heartbeat of wind and metal. Then, one last voice, quiet but sure, asked the viewers to honor those who serve not for glory, but for duty, courage, and heart.